these kinds of questions, right, about what to call this violence and what we focus on, really sort of inspired me to think about the kind of question about what's going on when these things occur, because they do occur and they keep occurring in American history, and they have become more and more destructive over the past, say, 50 years or so, right? I was in college and started thinking about an event that really shaped my kind of mind as a political activist, as a political thinker, and that was the LA riots, the Rodney King riots in 1992. I remember that was one of those big things that sort of just took over an entire spring, sort of the way in which the George Floyd case has sort of taken over our spring this year. Quite broadly, the Pew Center has noted that a majority of Americans agree with the Black Lives Matter movement, broadly speaking. Social movements are often not unitary in direction, and they're usually made up by many, many different groups of people, many, many different organizations, and sometimes these groups don't necessarily see eye to eye on things, and they have different kinds of agendas. And when we look back on them historically, we call it a movement, but at the time, many different kinds of groups are just simply doing their own thing, right? Even if you think of like the civil rights movement, there's big differences between like the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We call all of these groups now part of the civil rights movement, but there were really big disagreements, and sometimes really heated disagreements amongst many of the leaders in some of these groups. Back when Martin Luther King Jr. was alive, he was being asked questions about what to think about the riots in Watts in Los Angeles in 1965, or Detroit in 1967. There were all of these different kinds of riots going on, and he was asked to think, what should we think about this? Should we condemn the people that are doing this criminal activity? And my thinking about this issue was really formed by a speech that he gave very shortly before his assassination in 1968, and I think it's the Other America speech. He gave this, I think, in March of 1968, and he was asked directly, like, should we condemn people who engage in looting or property damage during protests? And what he said at that point was that it would be morally irresponsible of himself, to condemn the rioters without asking what were the conditions that led to the people involved to believe that criminal activity or destruction of property was the best reaction to their situation. So he was suggesting that when we think about this kind of political violence, there's a moral angle, a moral focus, and that is to open our aperture, so to speak, our moral aperture, and to say, instead of focusing on the individuals who are involved in the activity, the looters or the people who are destroying windows or things, just to ask, like, what's the bigger picture, and how can we think about violence in a broader way that can help us to analyze this, that doesn't put the blame entirely on the people who are doing the criminal activity. And this is not to say that the people who are looting or causing damage aren't responsible for their actions. I think King is saying that they are, but a really morally responsible reaction to urban violence like this must require us to sort of open up our perspective to ask, what's the bigger picture? Johan Galtung, the Norwegian sociologist, and what many people consider one of the founding fathers of the academic discipline of peace studies, peace and conflict studies. And over the years, Galtung has developed this theory of violence that is built around the idea, if you think sort of like of a kind of like a pyramid of violence. And so the way that he thinks about this is that at the very top of the pyramid of violence is what he wants to call direct violence or personal violence. Direct violence is the kind of violence that, when you ask people, like, what does violence look like to you? That's the kind of thing that they're going to most think about, is that sort of one person deciding to hurt person Y in a really direct and intentional way, either through physical violence, psychological violence, emotional violence of some sort. That's the picture that usually comes to mind. But usually those kinds of moments of spectacular violence happen because something's been brewing underneath. And so this is why I like the volcano metaphor, is that there's something brewing underneath that moment of spark that leads to the fist or the angry words or the looting or the breaking of a window. Something had to lead to that. And I think that that's what Dr. King was saying, was that when we want to have a morally responsible reaction to rioting, we have to look at those other factors that are leading to the violence eruption. And so what I think that what King and Galtung are saying in some sense is that when we see spectacular violence erupt at the top of the volcano or the pyramid, it's because people have been living in societies where the structure of things is such that it's really leading to diminished quality of life for them. And living in that kind of scenario for a long time can really lead to frustration, lead to despair and hopelessness, and that's what leads to that spark of direct violence. And so part of this is to get sort of a more adequate picture of like, why do these kinds of events happen, and what can we do about them? And so I think that once we have this kind of picture of structural violence, which we might call, right, white supremacist laws in society, right, the ways in which there's unfair discrimination against BIPOC people in the United States, all these kinds of things, we can start to sort of look to see like, what are the structures that might be leading to people to feel that riots, property destruction, these kinds of things are the proper responses. And so I think that, you know, what you see in Portland now is a lot of folks who are angered by the federal deployment of troops in ways that they consider to be authoritarian. You have a lot of people who are angry about the killing of Black folk in the United States. All of these things I think are related to questions about police authority and official state violence. And so I think that that's their underlying core. The issue, I think, is to try to make sure that there's ways in which we can recognize those commonalities and not let differences divide people. When you look at social movements, people are often very critical, like for instance of the Occupy Wall Street movement or something or other. But I think what these kinds of social movements do is they transform our public and social vocabulary about issues about justice. What I think a lot of people disagree about is what to do about that. But sort of this broad kind of sense that there's something problematic about police forces in the United States, this has become really widespread. And so I think a lot of people are now entertaining these kinds of questions of police violence, because for over 20 years now, people like Angela Davis have been talking about the question about what abolition means. And so I think that it's caught a lot of abolition activists off guard to sort of be front and center now with their ideas, because there's a groundswell of people who think, yeah, there's a big problem here. What do we do about it now? We've heard this kind of talk about abolition. What does it mean? Mm. And so I think that there's going to be, you know, in the next year or two, there's going to be a lot of questions about like what we can actually accomplish. Like, so I think there's a big difference between abolition and defunding and even disarming. At the end of World War II, human beings got together and we decided, look, we want to try to figure out how to build a world in which something like World War II and the Holocaust can never happen again. And so they commissioned philosophers to go out and to collect ideas about what would be the best kind of moral principles and ideas that we can come together to prevent a world of fascism and violence to ever set root in the world again. And the result of that project, started in 1948, was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Since 1948, humanity has taken on this project that is trying to figure out how to build a world in which we make sure that certain kinds of political structures don't have purchase in our world, and that we forefront the idea of all human beings as being equal and with dignity with one another.